Welcome csc121 to ex18, and this we actually used the test grade return that we used earlier in the semester, and we did some kind of more efficient ways of actually letting you input tests. The purpose of this, here's my first version right here, and I'm not going to go through typing all this code, but I'll just kind of show you the versions and then just kind of show you the troubleshooting that we did. We kind of explored this and just kind of went through it to try and make it more efficient in terms of creating separate functions and calling functions. But originally, the whole point of kind of doing this initially was going over returns, and I created a figure average function that returned sum t divided by num t. So basically the sum of whatever our tests were divided by the number of tests. Now, to get a sum and a number, instead of just kind of adding them up with some kind of counter like we did last time, or taking our variable and incrementing them on our very first version, what I did on this version was actually create a list called tests, and we're going to basically append or add to that list as we go. And also the idea is to have some kind of test input, and here's a test input here, and actually this is the finished version. Let me go back to, this is the original version right here. And the idea of this was to have an input, and here's the input up here, and you can see this code. That's why part of the reason we kind of studied this code, because it's all kinds of code just kind of all over the place, kind of not very organized. And after we did this one time, we went through and organized all the code into functions, so it wouldn't just be kind of a haphazard kind of setup of code here. We tried to organize it into functions a little bit better. But the first version here, see, here's the figure average and the return statement, and then up here here's test, there's the list I was talking about. And I started with something, making a variable called entry and saying while it's true, and using a while loop, meaning that while this condition is true, it's going to keep taking input for the test score, because the original test score we had to do it a set number of times. But this way we can actually just have one input and then just keep going through it until a certain condition is no longer true. And I had a little bit of a struggle with this, because the condition that I used, because I used an integer to input this stuff, I had a little bit of a problem, because I would append test scores, but then as I went through it, I wanted to type exit to get out of it. And it wouldn't let me use a string, because I was saying, okay, the input has to be an integer, and then it wasn't recognizing exit. So anyway, I ended up using a number 1 because I figured, well, no test score is going to be a 1, so that was kind of like my exit to get out. And then I actually, when we input it, actually before we even got to that point, we would basically append. Here's a statement, test.append, and every time, and it's appending test score. So every time we put in a test score, it would append it to the test list. So that kind of created a list of test scores. And then when we got to the point where we put in a 1, it would actually remove it. This is actually code to remove it, to do a -1 here, or you could use another one called delete. That would actually delete it from that list. But then we actually found out a better way to do that. And also a better way to do this, because I had while entry equals true, and then I have entry equals false. We then found out that we could use a break statement to break out of a while loop. If we just break out of this statement, then we don't need, this variable has no purpose. Then we could just do while true. So that's what we ended up doing. So we ended up going through this in a couple different steps and making it more efficient, and also fixing this problem too, so that we actually take a string first and don't actually convert it to an integer or a float until after we put in kind of the exit, so we could still use exit. So I'll kind of go back here to this one and show you what's happening here. So we have a function definition for figure average, and then we put this together in a function, the input. So, and then this is kind of the cleaned up version. It says while true, and then test score is the variable that represents our input. So if you put in, all your different grades, so I'll just run it just to show you what happens. I'll put in 90, I'll just do 90 4 times, because that's usually what I do, because it should be an average of 90. And then I'll hit exit. I'll hit exit here, and I get an error. Now that I put that in on purpose because we have an issue, because I want you to look at this error code, and it says division by 0, and it's showing you down at the bottom, recent call last, the most recent one. It's having a problem with the sum t versus this. So it's having a problem with this stuff, because this is actually we're declaring these variables before the function is run. So what's happening is these are being declared as 0 because we have nothing in the list. So it's summing it up and it's giving us a number of 0, and it's holding that when we run the function. That's why we have that issue there. So we're going to have to move that. So we put that in there as something to fix. So we're going to have to move this thing as part of ex18. And then there's some other things we're going to do too, because we don't need, we figured we don't even though this was what really started the exercise, we only need this thing. We only need this little average thing here to really figure out what we're doing at the end. Because we have an average that equals that. We don't even really need this function call. We could just use the calculation and save ourselves an extra function in here. So we'll go through and clean up some of that. And actually, let me do that right now. I'll just take this sumT versus numT, and I'll cut this, and I'll put it down here. We have an output average. Now, I didn't go over that yet, but this is kind of the stuff we did from the first exercise, where we basically have if-elif statements. And instead of just printing each one, we just assign it to a variable. So we could basically plug that variable into a print statement instead of just putting a letter afterwards like we did it last time. So what I'm going to do in here is just paste this in here. And that way it's calculating that in here, and we don't even need this function call. So this function call, we could just save ourselves some lines of code here and put that right in the average. So it's figuring out the average in there. Now we still have to be careful about what happens when those variables are declared. So, and let's look at this again, because this was kind of fixed up. We have while true, and we're going to enter a test score. And before we convert it to a float or an integer, we're going to say, okay, if you put in exit, it's going to break this. So it'll break that loop and basically end it. But before it does that, if you skip over that, if you don't enter exit, then it's going to say, okay, make it a float, and it's going to append it. So it's doing these things after you would have the opportunity to put exit in, which actually helped us from getting that string error by putting exit into a list of numbers. So we're putting all the numbers in as strings, and if you put exit, it'll break the loop, but then it'll still, any numbers you put in before you put exit, it'll still convert them to floats, and it'll still append them. It just will not append exit. Because it's not an integer yet, we don't have to worry about doing anything with it. And then these things here are just tests, just to see what's happening. So if I run it, you could see when I put in 90, although it's small down here, you could see it's actually keeping a little running tab of my test. So every time I put in one, I can see what's being added there. And then I even have one afterwards. I did that originally because to see what was happening if I put in 1 or exit or anything. But these are just for testing, so I could take them out. So this is the first part, the test input. So this is actually the first function that has to get run. And then after that function gets run, these things have to be declared. Because these things have to be declared after we have these things added to test, not now. So this thing has to get moved. So actually, let me cut this out of here, because that was one of the things we had to do to fix it. We could still leave tests up here. And I'm going to move down here to the bottom, and here are our function calls. Test input, and I'm just going to put this here right now, and just put these variables that represent that in between. So when we do the test input, it's going to get these numbers, and then when we do the output average, which is this, here's output average, it's running that second, it's now going to have, it'll now have these values in here. They won't be zeros anymore, so we shouldn't have that error anymore. So again, what we have here is two functions. We're still setting up tests in here as, we're setting up test as a global variable because it's being used here. And then I think it's going to be used here too, because these are taking it from tests. So that's why we're keeping it outside of the function, outside of being a local. And some of the things we're doing in here, you know how to do already. We're saying average equals round, we're rounding it down to 2. We did that all last time. So this stuff is nothing new other than we're just setting a variable that equals the letter. And then we're just printing out a statement that says, okay, the average of this many tests, and that's where we have numT, is this average, which is a grade of grade. And then at the end, this is basically, we have two function calls, and we're just sticking our variables for the tests, for the list. Those are the list of grades, the length of the list, and the sum of the test. That's what's, and then it's figuring that out ahead of time. So, you could try putting that inside a function somewhere. You could try putting that at the end of this one or something. It might work there, but there's nothing wrong with necessarily with having it here which showing that you have to figure that stuff out before you get to there. But for now, I'll just show you some of this code here. Again, just if you need to see this, we're starting off with a test list, and then we're running test input, and that's where it's running a loop that's letting us enter grades. So let me start over again, and I'll enter 90, 90, 90. I'll do 3, and then for the last one, I'll hit exit, and I'll hit enter. And then it says the average of 3 tests is 90%, which is a grade of an A. So what happens here, again, just to run through this, is as we were doing this, I'd add a 90, a 90, and a 90 here, and it's putting it in this list, and there's the list right there. And it's skipping over the if statement, so it's making it a float. That's why it has 90.0. And it's also appending it to the list. That's why there's 3 of them in there. And again, we're just printing it just to test it out. And then once we do that, once I hit exit, because sooner or later I'm going to hit exit, once I hit exit, it breaks the loop, and then it basically moves us on to the next, prints out this last statement here, and then it moves us on because it's going to stay within this function running until the next function. And then what's going to happen is this thing down here, after that first function of test input, it's going to say, okay, we're going to add up the tests, and then we're going to add up the tests, and we're going to take the number of the tests, and then we're going to go to output average, and output average is basically going to take that sum t and num t and average it up. Now we could put that in there just as long as the tests, you can pull tests in there because test is global, so it should. So we could just try this to see if it works. We could put this in here. We could cut this out of here. That way we'll just have 2 function calls. We could put this right at the beginning of this, and you can see already it's saying it doesn't know where that stuff's coming from. But if we put this in here, I'll put this in here, I'll tab over, so it's now in the function, and I shouldn't see, let's see what it's saying about the unexpected indent. Yeah, I went too far with the indent. I was looking at that line there. So anyway, this should work now, and it should still pull tests because test is global. So it shouldn't have a problem having the global tests. Here's tests up here. It shouldn't have a problem taking that value into the function. It's basically going from a value that's in one function and going to another function, because it's basically any value in here, it's taking it outside of the function, putting it in the global variable, and then this is pulling in the global variable. So this should work again. So let me just run it, make sure it does, and I'll just put in 80. I'll do 80 this time. 80, 80, 80, and then I'll hit exit, and it says the average of 3 tests is 80, which is a grade of B. And that's because here's my condition that's saying it's a B. So that's what's happening there. So it's not really anything new that we're doing here. It's just we're learning to write our code a little more efficiently. We're grouping it in functions, which makes it more organized, structured better. It's easier to see our sequence. We know that we're going to do the test input first, then the output average. And if we have any errors or any bugs in it, or which we had because of the 0 division error, we got to make sure either this is available in this function before we try and divide anything, or in the other function, which we decided we didn't even need it as a separate function. So this is ex18testGradeReturn. Again, using a couple new concepts here with the while loop, appending to a list, and putting our if inside a while loop, and breaking a while loop, which will break out of it. So we have kind of our escape out of the loop there, using some print values to test. And then basically just figuring out averages, rounding them off, and outputting grades, and throwing them all together. Everything that we did here is basically just doing one print statement. And then we have variables to throw in our print statement. We have num_t, we have average, and we have grade that we're just throwing in there. So that's why we created these variables here, num_t, sum_t, average, all that, using average as the determinant to what the grade is, and all that kind of works down there. So we have 3 values at the end that we're using. And 2 function calls. You could always throw this in a main function call somehow if you only want 1 function call, but it's just running these 2 function calls, so you wouldn't have that much of a problem with it. So again, that's the end of the code here. I'll just move up. This is the output average. I'll move this down in case you need to look at it for some reason, or just kind of stop the video. So this is the output average. This is the first one that we did, the test input. That's basically appending to a test, and then at the end we just have 1 print statement. So that's what's happening at the end. So that's our code. So if you need to stop this or look at it anywhere, I recommend that you kind of go through this and kind of study it a little. That's what we try to do with paper versions in class. But anyway, that's EX18 test grade return.